Welcome back to Velvet Shadows. Before we get into tonight's story, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing where our community is tuning in from. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's get into it. The moment Genevieve Ashton saw the painting, she didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for her phone. She simply stood in the center of the atrium at the Whitmore Foundation Gala, holding a glass of Sincere she would never finish, and looked at the oil canvas mounted on the east wall. The one her late mother had painted in the last year of her life, the one that had hung in the Sterling House on Beacon Hill for 32 years, the one that Genevieve had watched her husband Miles load into a climate-controlled crate 6 months ago when he told her it was going into private storage. It was hanging on the wall of the most prestigious charity auction in Boston. And standing beside it, laughing at something a man in a navy blazer had just whispered to her, was a 27-year-old named Tessa Vane, who happened to be wearing Genevieve's mother's pearl drop earrings. Genevieve set her wine glass down on the nearest tray. She smoothed the front of her midnight blue gown, and she smiled the kind of smile that takes years to learn. The kind that looks like grace from a distance, but reads, up close, like a door being locked from the inside. She had known something was wrong for 8 months. She just hadn't known it was this wrong. Here's what you need to understand about Genevieve Ashton. She wasn't the kind of woman who got famous for being rich. She was the kind of woman who made the rich feel lucky to be in the same room as her. At 44, she had spent 20 years building the Ashton Whitmore Foundation from a small family endowment into one of the most influential cultural institutions on the East Coast. She had chaired 3 board directorships, raised 2 sons through boarding school and college almost entirely on her own because Miles traveled, and had quietly, methodically turned her mother's modest estate into a legacy, the painting on the wall. Blue Morning, Gloucester, was appraised at $1.2 million. But that number meant nothing. What mattered was that her mother, Rosalind, had painted it the year she was diagnosed. She had painted it looking out the window of the Cape Ann house, where Genevieve had learned to read, where Genevieve had sat with her on the last night of her life and held her hand while the tide came in. Rosalind had signed the back of it in pencil. For Jenny, when the world gets too loud, look at the water. Miles had known that. He had stood in the room when Genevieve's attorney read the will. He had held her hand at the funeral. He had said, more than once, that the painting was the most valuable thing in their home. Apparently it meant that in a more literal sense than she'd realized. Genevieve didn't go straight to the painting. That would have been the wrong move. And Genevieve Ashton had not survived 2 decades of nonprofit politics and Boston old money by making wrong moves at formal events. Instead, she crossed the room toward the east corridor, stopped to greet Harriet Ellison from the museum board, laughed at something that wasn't particularly funny, accepted a new glass of wine she had no intention of drinking, and positioned herself near the large floral arrangement at the edge of the atrium where she had a clear sightline to both the painting and the woman standing beside it, Tessa Vane. Genevieve had heard the name 4 months ago from her assistant, Bridget, who had the particular skill of mentioning things without appearing to mention them. Miles had lunch at Torcello again this week. I saw it on the card statement when I was reconciling accounts. He went 3 times. And then, 2 weeks later, almost as an afterthought, the reservation was for 2. The other name was a Vane. T. Vane. Bridget had been with Genevieve for 11 years. She did not say things by accident. Genevieve had spent the next 4 months watching. Not frantically, not obsessively. She was not that kind of woman. She had spent those 4 months the way a chess player studies the board before moving a piece, methodical, patient, waiting to understand not just what was happening, but the full scope of it. Because in her experience, when a man like Miles did something, there was always more underneath. She had been right. What she had uncovered, piece by piece, through a forensic accountant named Douglas Hale, whom she'd hired quietly through a firm in New York with no connection to anyone in her social circle, was this. Over the course of 3 years, Miles had been systematically removing assets from their shared estate. Not dramatically, Not all at once. The kind of slow, careful erosion that was designed to be invisible. A painting moved to storage. An account restructured. A LLC in Delaware that Genevieve had signed documents for without reading carefully enough, because she had trusted him. Because after 22 years, she had just stopped reading everything carefully. That LLC had received 11 transfers totaling $3.4 million, and the registered co-manager of that LLC was Tessa Vane. Genevieve had received Douglas Hale's final report. She had read it twice, alone, in the library of their Beacon Hill house, with the lights low and the door closed. Then she had called her attorney, Patricia Holt at Holt and Brennan, one of the most quietly formidable divorce and asset attorneys in Massachusetts. And then she had done something that very few people in her position would have done. She had waited. She had waited. Because the Whitmore Gala was 9 days away, and she had known. Because she knew Miles, that he would bring Tessa. He had been escalating for months, growing bolder, the way men do, when they believe the woman at home has no idea. He had started coming home later. Stopped asking about her schedule. Attended 2 foundation events without her, for the first time in their marriage. Claiming work conflicts. He wanted out. She could feel it. He was building towards something, and he thought he was ahead of her. He had no idea that the board of the Whitmore Foundation had received an anonymous tip from an attorney, acting on behalf of an unnamed client, that one of the items consigned to tonight's auction may have been misrepresented in its provenance documentation. Miles Ashton had consigned Blue Morning, Gloucester, to the Whitmore auction 3 weeks ago. He had forged Genevieve's signature on the consignment paperwork. He had listed it as jointly owned property being donated by the Ashton family. He had not consulted her. He had not told her. He had instead planned to use the foundation she had built, the institution that bore her family's name, to publicly liquidate her mother's painting and funnel the proceeds into the account he shared with a woman who was currently wearing Rosalind's pearl earrings and laughing in the East Atrium. Genevieve watched Tessa for a long moment. She was young, genuinely young, the kind of young that hasn't learned yet that a man who will do this to one woman will eventually do it to another. She was pretty in the way that got attention in a room like this. Bright dress, easy laugh, comfortable, on Miles's arm, in a way that suggested she believed she'd arrived somewhere. She had no idea that she was standing inside a situation that was about to take the floor out from under her. Genevieve almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Miles came through the north entrance at 8:47. Genevieve knew this because she had positioned herself to see it. He was in his dark gray Brioni, her favorite of his suits, which she had always suspected he wore deliberately, and he was scanning the room with the particular expression of a man who feels ownership over a space. He spotted the painting first. Then Tessa. Then, a beat later, he saw Genevieve. She watched his face. There it was, the flicker, the recalibration, the almost invisible pause while he decided how to arrange his features. And then the smile, practiced warm, the smile she had watched him deploy at 1,000 events over 22 years. He crossed the room toward her. Genevieve. He kissed her cheek. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn for a decade. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she said. "So does Mother's painting?" The pause that followed was very small. Anyone watching from across the room would have seen nothing. But Genevieve had spent 22 years learning the grammar of Miles Ashton's silences, and this one said, "She knows something. But how much?" "I thought deserved a proper audience," he said carefully. "The foundation, the cause, Rosalind would have approved." "She would have," Genevieve agreed. "She would have approved even more of being asked." Miles opened his mouth, closed it. Then, "We can discuss this later." "We won't need to," Genevieve said pleasantly. And she smiled at him, that same locked door smile, and turned toward the center of the room where the Whitmore Foundation's executive director, a woman named Caroline Ferris, was making her way through the crowd toward the podium. The program was set to begin at 9. At 8:58, 2 things happened in close succession. The first was that Patricia Holt arrived. Not dramatically. Patricia never did anything dramatically, which was precisely why she was exceptional at her job. She arrived as a guest, which she was, having received her invitation 6 weeks ago at Genevieve's quiet suggestion. She was wearing charcoal silk and carrying a structured clutch that contained, among other things, a notarized letter from Douglas Hale, a certified copy of Rosalind Ashton's will, and a cease and desist order ready to be filed the following morning. The second was that Caroline Ferris, before taking the podium, stopped to speak briefly with the Foundation's legal counsel, who had that afternoon received a call from Patricia's office flagging a potential issue with one of the auction items' provenance documentation. They spoke for approximately 4 minutes. Genevieve watched from across the room. At 9:03, Caroline Ferris took the podium and welcomed the room with the warmth and competence of someone who had run high-stakes events for 20 years. She thanked the donors, honored the Foundation's history, spoke briefly about the year's grant recipients, and then she said, with perfect composure, that after a routine review of auction item documentation, the Foundation had made the decision to temporarily withdraw Lot 17. Blue Morning, Gloucester, attributed to Rosalind Ashton, pending verification of provenance. We hold ourselves to the highest standards of transparency, Caroline said, and that means taking the time to ensure every item in our auction reflects this institution was built on. It was a masterclass in institutional language. Clinical, professional. It said everything and named no one. But in a room that small with people that well connected, silence has its own vocabulary. Genevieve watched the painting's placard being quietly removed by a Foundation staff member. She watched Miles go very still. She watched Tessa glance at Miles with an expression that had shifted from confident to uncertain, the first crack in a composure that had held all evening. Then, Genevieve did something she had planned for exactly this moment. She walked directly to Tessa Vane, not to Miles. To Tessa. She crossed the room unhurriedly, the way she crossed every room, and decided to let others use it. When she reached Tessa, she extended her hand, and her voice was low and entirely without performance. "I'm Genevieve Ashton," she said. "The painting is my mother's. The earrings are also hers. I'm not angry at you. I'd like them back." Tessa stared at her. There was a long moment, 4, maybe 5 seconds, during which the noise of the gala continued around them, crystal and conversation and the sound of heels on marble, and in the middle of it, Tessa Vane looked at Genevieve Ashton with something that looked, surprisingly, like recognition. She reached up, unclipped the first earring, then the second. She placed them in Genevieve's open palm without a word. Her eyes were bright, not with cruelty, with something closer to shame. And then she said, quietly enough that only Genevieve could hear, "I didn't know about the painting. He said it was already donated." "I believe you," Genevieve said. And she did. She closed her hand around her mother's earrings and turned back toward the room. Miles was watching her from 12 feet away. He had gone from still to pale, the color leaving his face the way it leaves a room when someone opens a window in winter. Around him, conversations continued, but the particular gravity of the moment had not been lost on the people who knew how to read rooms like this, and in Boston's Foundation world, almost everyone did. Genevieve walked toward her husband. She stopped close enough that they were speaking to each other, not to the room. "Patricia is here tonight," she said quietly. "She'll be in touch with your attorney tomorrow morning. The LLC dissolution paperwork is already drafted. The forensic accounting is complete. Douglas Hale is very thorough, Miles. I'd recommend you speak to someone before the weekend." Miles said nothing. His jaw was doing something complicated. "The house on Beacon Hill is in my name," Genevieve continued, still quietly, still pleasantly, as though she were discussing the auction program. "The Cape Ann house was my mother's and came to me through her estate. I'd appreciate not having to involve the courts in either of those, but I'm prepared to—" "Genevieve." "The painting comes home tonight," she said. "I arranged it with Caroline. It will be transported back to the house by the Foundation's courier after the event. I thought you should know that, before you said anything else." Miles looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not remorse. Exactly. More like a man watching a door close that he had assumed would always be open. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough," she said. She turned and walked back toward the center of the room, toward Caroline Ferris and Patricia Holt, and the foundation she had spent 20 years building, and as she moved through the crowd, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could name. Not triumph. Triumph was too hot, too young, too unsteady. This was something quieter. This was the feeling of a woman who had walked into a room that was designed to take something from her, and was walking out with everything that mattered. People noticed. In a room like that, they always noticed. Caroline touched her arm as she passed and whispered, "You handled that beautifully." A board member she'd known for 15 years raised his glass in a small, private acknowledgement. The foundation's development director, who had worked alongside Genevieve for a decade and knew more than she ever let on, simply caught her eye and nodded. Genevieve accepted a fresh glass of wine. She looked around the room, at the art on the walls, at the people she had known for years, at the east wall, where her mother's painting had hung an hour ago. She thought about Rosalind, about that last night on the Cape, the tide coming in, the way her mother had squeezed her hand and said, "You've always been the strongest one in any room, Jenny. You just forget sometimes because you're too busy being kind." She had not forgotten tonight. The gala continued for another 2 hours. Genevieve stayed for all of it. She drank her wine. She spoke with guests. She accepted a brief interview with the foundation's newsletter photographer, and at 11:15, when the evening formally concluded, she was among the last to leave. Miles left before 10. She watched him go. Tessa Vane left at 9:30, alone. The painting was loaded into the foundation's transport vehicle at 11:40. Genevieve had arranged for it to be brought directly to the Cape Ann house, not Beacon Hill. She would hang it there, back where it had always been, in the house that smelled like salt and old wood and her mother's oil paints. For Jenny. When the world gets too loud, look at the water. She would look at the water. In the weeks that followed, the story moved the way these stories move in circles where discretion is currency. Not loudly, not publicly, but thoroughly. Within the Boston Foundation world, within the boards and the charity circuits and the old money networks that run deeper than any news cycle, what happened at the Whitmore Gala became one of those stories that people referenced without naming names. The shorthand for a particular kind of reckoning. Miles Ashton's attorney contacted Patricia Holt the following Monday morning. By Thursday, preliminary divorce terms had been submitted. The LLC in Delaware was dissolved within 60 days. Douglas Hale's accounting was entered into the record. The $3.4 million in transferred assets was subject to clawback proceedings, which Miles's attorney, after reviewing the documentation, advised his client not to contest. The Whitmore Foundation issued a brief statement confirming that Lot 17 had been withdrawn from auction due to a documentation discrepancy, and that the matter had been resolved privately to the satisfaction of all parties. Caroline Ferris sent Genevieve a handwritten note the following week. It said, "I've always believed this foundation runs on integrity. It's easier when the people who built it still do too." Genevieve framed it. She put it in her office, next to a photograph of her mother. There were things, of course, that hurt. She would be lying if she said otherwise. 22 years is not nothing. The version of Miles she had loved. The man from the early years, the man who had driven her to the Cape on their first anniversary and stood in the kitchen of her mother's house with a bottle of wine and absolutely no idea what he was doing. That man had been real, or real enough that she had built a life around him. Grief is complicated when the person you're grieving is still alive and simply became someone else. She allowed herself to feel that without apology in private, in the way she had learned to do most things that mattered, but she did not allow it to be the loudest thing. The loudest thing, or rather, the steadiest thing, the thing that held, was this. She was still herself. She had come into that gala as Genevieve Ashton, and she had left as Genevieve Ashton, and whatever Miles had tried to take from her, he had not managed to take that. Her name was still on the foundation. Her mother's painting was back where it belonged. Her mother's earrings were in the small ceramic dish on her dresser, where they had always been. She woke up the morning after the gala at 5:45, earlier than usual, and drove to Cape Ann before the traffic built. She let herself into the house with the key she had carried since she was 19 years old. She made coffee in the old percolator that had been her mother's. She stood at the east window with her mug and looked out at the water, gray and enormous and entirely indifferent to the smallness of everything that had happened, and she felt, for the first time in months, the particular quality of quiet that is not emptiness but space. The Foundation courier had done their job well. Blue morning. Gloucester was leaning against the wall in the hallway, still crated, waiting to be hung. She would hang it herself. She always had. She drank her coffee. She watched the water. The tide was coming in. And Genevieve Ashton, who had walked into a room designed to diminish her and walked out with her mother's painting and her own name intact, let the morning be exactly what it was, ordinary and hers and enough.